Northern Albania in 1985 was not a place where formal authority held much weight in the daily lives of those living in the highlands. The state existed functionally in the lowlands and in the administrative centers, but in the mountain villages scattered across the rugged terrain between Shadar and the northern borderlands, a different set of principles governed behavior, reputation, and consequence. These were not written laws in any modern sense. They were inherited understandings passed down through generations, embedded so deeply in the social fabric that they required no documentation, no enforcement by external bodies, no courts to validate them. They simply were. And to violate them was to step outside the protection of the community itself, to become something other than a member in good standing, to become marked. The year 1985 fell within a peculiar moment in Albanian history. The country remained isolated, locked under the rigid control of Enver Hoxha's regime, a system that had severed ties with both the Soviet Union and China, leaving Albania alone in its particular interpretation of socialist governance. But even within that isolation, even within the reach of the Sigurimi, the state security apparatus, there were spaces where older codes persisted quietly, beneath the surface, woven into family relations and village hierarchies in ways that no ideology could fully dismantle. The highlands were one such space. The villages there were small, often no more than a few dozen families clustered around a central clearing or a narrow dirt road that wound up into the mountains. Stone houses with slate roofs, narrow windows, courtyards enclosed by low walls, sheep moving slowly across the slopes. Men gathering in the late afternoon near the village center, speaking in low voices, smoking hand-rolled cigarettes, watching the movements of others with the quiet attentiveness that comes from living in a place where everyone knows everyone, where reputation is built over decades and can be destroyed in a single afternoon. In one such village, whose name has been rendered in various forms in the few accounts that exist, there lived two families whose histories were intertwined in the way that only proximity and shared hardship can create. They were not enemies in the sense of open conflict. They were not friends in the sense of warmth or affection. They were neighbors, bound by mutual dependence and mutual suspicion, by the need to coexist in a place where resources were scarce, and survival required a degree of cooperation that no individual household could manage alone. The families shared access to a stretch of pasture land that lay on the upper slope of the valley, a piece of ground that was not particularly fertile, but was necessary for grazing during the warmer months. The arrangement was old, predating anyone's clear memory of its origin. It was simply understood that both families could use the land, that neither had exclusive claim, and that any dispute over its use would be resolved through negotiation, through the involvement of respected elders, through the mechanisms that had always existed to prevent small disagreements from becoming something worse. But in the spring of 1985, something shifted. One of the families, the younger generation specifically, began to extend their use of the pasture in ways that the other family found unacceptable. It was not a dramatic seizure. It was a series of small encroachments. Fences moved slightly. Grazing periods extended. Sheep driven onto sections of the land that had traditionally been left for the other family's use during certain weeks of the season. These were not accidents. They were deliberate adjustments, quiet tests of what would be tolerated, what would be challenged, and what would be allowed to stand. The other family noticed. Of course they noticed. In a place where every boundary is known, where every slight is weighed and catalogued, nothing goes unobserved. But the initial response was restrained. There were conversations, indirect at first, conducted through intermediaries, through cousins and uncles who had relationships with both sides. The message was clear. The changes were not acceptable. The old arrangement needed to be respected, and if there was a need to renegotiate the terms, that renegotiation had to happen openly, with the involvement of the community, not through unilateral action. The younger men on the encroaching side did not respond in the way that tradition required. They did not seek mediation. They did not acknowledge the complaint. They simply continued, and in continuing, they made a choice. They chose to treat the matter as one of strength rather than custom, as a question of who could take and hold rather than who had the right to use. This was a miscalculation, though it may not have seemed so at the time. In a place governed by state law alone, such a conflict might have been settled through courts, through documentation, through bureaucratic processes. But in the highlands, where the state's presence was thin and its legitimacy questioned, the mechanisms of resolution were different. They were older, more personal, and far less forgiving. The elders of the village were eventually brought in, not by the offending family, but by others who could see where the fanned situation was heading. These were men in their 60s and 70s, men who had lived through wars and occupations, through famines and feuds, men whose authority rested not on any formal title, but on the accumulated weight of their experience and the respect they commanded through decades of careful judgment. They gathered in one of the stone houses near the center of the village, a place with thick walls and a small fire burning in the corner. And they listened, took hours. Each family sent representatives, and each representative spoke at length, recounting not just the immediate dispute, but the history of relations between the families, the previous disagreements, the ways in which trust had been maintained or eroded over the years. The elders asked questions. They clarified points of confusion. They pressed for specifics. And when they had heard enough, they deliberated among themselves, speaking in the dialect of the region, a variant of Albanian that carried words and phrases unique to the highlands, terms that had no exact equivalent in the language spoken in Tirana or along the coast. Their conclusion was straightforward. The encroachment had to stop. The old boundaries had to be restored. The younger men who had initiated the changes had to acknowledge the violation and make a formal apology, not just to the other family but to the village as a whole, because the violation was not simply a private matter, but a disruption of the order that kept the community stable. And there had to be a small compensation, not monetary but symbolic, something that would mark the seriousness of the offending family to accept responsibility. This was not a harsh judgment. It was, by the standards of the region, lenient. It allowed the family to save face, to correct the situation without being humiliated, to reintegrate into the community's good graces without enduring the kind of lasting consequences that could follow a more serious breach. But the younger men refused. They did not refuse openly, not at first. They accepted the judgment in the moment, nodded their agreement, offered the appropriate words of respect to the elders. But they did not follow through. The fences remained where they had been moved. The grazing patterns did not change. The apology was never offered. And the compensation, the symbolic gesture that was meant to close the matter, never materialized. This refusal was noted. It was discussed quietly, in the evening gatherings, in the conversations that took place outside the hearing of the offending family. The refusal changed the nature of the situation. It was no longer a dispute over land. It was now a challenge to the authority of the elders, a rejection of the mechanisms that held the community together, an indication that the younger men believed they could act with impunity, that they could ignore the judgment of those who were meant to resolve such conflicts. In a place like this, such a belief was dangerous, not just for the individuals involved but for everyone who depended on the system to function. The other family, the one whose grazing rights had been encroached upon, was now in a difficult position. They had followed the proper steps. They had sought mediation. They had accepted the judgment of the elders, but the judgment had been ignored, and they were left with no recourse within the traditional framework. To escalate further, to take direct action, would itself be a violation, a breach of the process that was meant to prevent exactly that kind of escalation. But to do nothing was also unacceptable. To allow the offense to stand was to signal weakness, to invite further encroachment, to undermine their own standing in the village. The summer passed slowly. The tension did not dissipate. It settled over the village like a weight, present in every interaction, in every glance, in every conversation that stopped when someone from the wrong family approached. The men of both families moved through the village with a heightened awareness, careful not to be alone, careful not to provoke, but also careful not to appear afraid. The women, too, felt the strain. They continued their routines, fetching water, tending gardens, preparing meals, but they did so with an underlying anxiety, knowing that the situation had reached a point where small accidents could become pretexts, where misunderstandings could escalate into something worse. By late summer, the offending family's behavior had become more open in its defiance. They were no longer simply continuing the encroachment. They were expanding it. They began to use sections of the pasture that had not even been in dispute, areas that were clearly, by any interpretation, meant for the other family's exclusive use during certain periods. This was no longer a matter of miscommunication or differing interpretations. A statement that the old rules no longer applied, that the younger men had decided they could rewrite the terms of coexistence without consequence. The village's response came not from the elders this time, but from a broader consensus, a quiet agreement among the heads of the other families, including those who had no direct stake in the land dispute but who understood that allowing this behavior to continue would set a precedent that could unravel the entire structure of mutual obligation and restraint. The decision was not announced. There was no meeting where it was formally declared. It emerged instead through a series of conversations, through a gradual alignment of understanding, through the kind of collective judgment that forms in communities where power is diffused rather than centralized. The 12 men who had been most directly involved in the encroachment, who had refused the elders' judgment, who had continued and expanded the violation, were marked. This marking was not literal. There was no physical sign, no tattoo or brand. The marking was social, a designation that placed them outside the normal protections of community life. They were not expelled from the village. They continued to live in their homes, to move through the same spaces, to interact with others, but the nature of those interactions changed. People stopped offering assistance. Invitations were not extended. Business dealings, the small exchanges of goods and labor that kept rural life functioning, became more difficult. The marked men found themselves increasingly isolated, not through any single dramatic act, but through 1,000 small withdrawals, a collective turning away that was all the more effective for being unspoken. This state of exclusion might have continued indefinitely, a kind of social exile that would have gradually forced the marked men to either leave the village or find some way to make amends. But the exclusion carried with it another dimension, one that was understood but rarely articulated. In the highlands, where the code of blood was not merely a historical curiosity, but a living practice, to be marked in this way was to be placed in a state of vulnerability. The protections that normally applied, the informal guarantees of safety that came from being a recognized member of the community, no longer held in the same way. The marked men were not targets in the sense of being hunted, but they were exposed, available to consequences that would not apply to others, and those consequences did not require approval from any authority. They simply required an opportunity and a decision by someone who believed they had cause. The autumn of 1985 brought cooler weather and a seasonal movement of flocks down from the high pastures. The marked men continued their routines, perhaps believing that the situation would eventually normalize, that the village's anger would fade, that they could outlast the social pressure. But they had misread the situation. The village had not forgotten. The offense was still present, still unresolved, and the marked men's continued defiance only reinforced the community's judgment that something had to shift. What happened in the weeks that followed has been documented in various forms, though the details remain fragmentary and often contradictory. The accounts that exist, drawn from later testimonies and investigations, suggest that the marked men began to disappear from public life. Some reportedly left the village, heading south toward the lowlands or across the border into Kosovo, seeking distance from a situation they could no longer manage. Others remained but became increasingly withdrawn, staying within their homes, avoiding the village center, limiting their movements to the bare necessities of survival. And some, according to the accounts, did not survive the autumn. The phrase used in the documents is careful, neutral in its construction. They were removed from the situation. The specifics of how this removal occurred are not detailed in ways that would satisfy a legal proceeding. There are no crime scene reports in the conventional sense, no autopsies, no arrests made by state authorities. What exists instead are references to men who were last seen on a particular road or near a particular morning, and who were not seen again. Their families, when asked, offered little information. Some claimed ignorance. Others suggested that the men had left voluntarily, that they had decided the village was no longer safe, that they had sought refuge elsewhere. A few acknowledged in indirect language that the men had been dealt with, that the community had resolved the matter in the way that such matters had always been resolved when all other mechanisms failed. The state's response when it came was limited. The Sigurimi conducted interviews. They gathered statements. They filed reports that noted the disappearances in the context of the land dispute. But the investigations did not result in prosecutions. This was not unusual. The highlands had always been a difficult area for state enforcement, and in 1985, with the regime facing economic challenges and international isolation, the resources and political will to pursue justice for what appeared to be an internal village matter were limited. The official position, to the extent that one can be discerned from the surviving records, was that the men had left the area voluntarily, that the situation had been resolved through traditional means, and that further intervention would be counterproductive. This resolution, such as it was, allowed the village to return to a semblance of normalcy. The land dispute was settled, not through negotiation, but through the removal of those who had refused to negotiate. The grazing rights reverted to the traditional arrangement. The other families in the village resumed their routines, though the memory of what had happened remained, a reminder of the costs of defiance, of the limits of tolerance, of the ways in which old codes could still assert themselves even within a system that officially rejected them. The families of the marked men remained in the village, at least initially. They were not held collectively responsible in the formal sense, but their social standing was diminished. They were tainted by association, and while they were not marked themselves, they existed in a state of reduced status, careful not to provoke further attention, careful to demonstrate compliance with the village's expectations. Some eventually left, moving to cities where anonymity was possible, where the past could be partially obscured, where the weight of collective memory was lighter. Others stayed, accepting their reduced circumstances, integrating as best they could into a community that had not forgotten, but had decided not to pursue the matter further. The story of the 12 marked men is not widely known outside the region, and even within the region it exists more as a cautionary tale than as a documented historical event. There are no monuments, no official acknowledgments, no public reckonings with what occurred. The village itself has changed in the decades since. The isolation that defined life in the highlands has diminished. Roads have been improved. Television and later internet have brought outside influences. The younger generations have left in large numbers, seeking opportunities in Tirana and other European countries, in places where the old codes have no relevance. But among those who remain, and among those who have returned for visits, the memory persists. It is spoken of in careful terms, in conversations that begin with questions about family history and end with references to the time when the rules were broken and the community responded. The tone of these conversations is not celebratory. There is no pride in what happened, no sense that justice was served in any clean or satisfying way. There is instead a kind of somber acknowledgement that the situation unfolded as it had to. Given the circumstances, given the refusal of the offending party to accept the community's judgment, given the limits of what could be tolerated without undermining the entire structure of mutual obligation. The phrase that recurs in these conversations, translated loosely, is that the men brought it upon themselves. This is not meant to absolve the community of responsibility. It is meant instead to convey the sense that the outcome was determined by choices, that the marked men had multiple opportunities to correct course, that the escalation was not inevitable but was made so by their continued defiance. In this interpretation, the community acted not out of malice but out of necessity, preserving the order that allowed everyone else to coexist, even if that preservation required the removal of those who would not accept its terms. This interpretation is, of course, contested. From a legal perspective, from the perspective of modern state authority, what happened in the village in 1985 was a series of extrajudicial killings, a breakdown of the rule of law, a reversion to violence as a means of settling disputes. From a human rights perspective, the marked men were victims, denied due process, denied the protections that any individual should expect, punished not through transparent mechanisms but through collective judgment that operated outside any framework of accountability. These perspectives are not wrong. They identify real failures, real injustices, real harms, but they also exist at a distance from the lived reality of the village in 1985, from the constraints and pressures that shape decision-making, from the absence of functional alternatives that might have allowed for a different outcome. The highlands in 1985 were not a place where state authority was trusted or effective. They were not a place where courts could be relied upon to enforce agreements or protect rights. They were a place where survival depended on the maintenance of local order, on the willingness of individuals to adhere to shared understandings, and on the capacity of the community to respond when those understandings were violated. In such a place, the mechanisms of response were necessarily different from those that would apply in a context where state authority was functional and legitimate. They were harsher, more direct, more personal. But they were also, from the community's perspective, the only mechanisms available. The absence of better alternatives does not make what happened acceptable, but it does complicate the moral clarity with which it might be judged from a distance. The 12 marked men of 1985 exist now primarily as a story, a narrative told in certain contexts to convey certain lessons. The details have been simplified over time, the ambiguity smoothed away, the individual choices and personalities reduced to archetypes. The men themselves, whatever their names were, whatever their particular motivations and fears and hopes might have been, have become symbols, representations of a broader principle about the costs of defiance and the limits of individual autonomy within a tightly bound community. This transformation from lived experience to cautionary tale is common in places where history is transmitted orally, where documentation is sparse, where the mechanisms of collective memory prioritize moral instruction over factual precision. The story is not told to preserve the truth of what happened in all its complexity. It is told to ensure that the lesson is not forgotten, that future generations understand the stakes of their choices, that the codes which govern behavior are reinforced through repetition and example. In this sense, the story of the 12 marked men functions less as history and more as myth, not in the sense of being false, but in the sense of carrying meaning that transcends the particular facts of the case. The village where this occurred has changed, as noted earlier, but not in ways that have entirely erased the past. The stone houses remain, though some have been abandoned, their roofs caving in, their walls slowly crumbling. The pasture land that was the source of the dispute is still used, though by fewer families now, and the old arrangements about who can graze where and when have lost much of their force. The younger generation, those born after 1985, have little direct knowledge of what happened. They know the story in its simplified form, but they do not know the men involved, do not remember the tension that defined that summer and autumn, do not carry the same sense of the codes as something living and immediate. For them, the story belongs to a past that is increasingly distant, a world that seems almost foreign in its constraints and its violence. But the past is not entirely dormant. there are still moments when it reasserts itself. When conflicts arise that echo the dynamics of 1985, when individuals make choices that the community finds unacceptable and must decide how to respond. These moments are less frequent now, and they are resolved through different mechanisms, through involvement of police and courts, through mediation processes that draw on both traditional and modern frameworks. But the underlying tension remains, the question of how a community maintains order when its members do not share a common commitment to the rules, when some are willing to exploit the gaps in enforcement, when the costs of defiance are not immediately clear. The story of the 12 marked men is also a story about the relationship between individual and collective, about the ways in which personal choices are constrained and shaped by social context, about the limits of autonomy in places where survival depends on cooperation. The marked men were not acting in a vacuum. They were making choices within a specific set of circumstances, responding to pressures and incentives that made sense from their perspective. Even if those choices ultimately proved disastrous, they may have believed that the old codes were weakening, that the presence of the state, even if limited, provided them with protection that previous generations had not enjoyed, that they could push boundaries without facing the traditional consequences. They may have believed that the elders' authority was waning, that the younger generation could establish new norms, that the community would ultimately accept their actions rather than fracture over them. These beliefs were not entirely unfounded. The codes were weakening, at least in some respects. The state's presence, while limited, was more substantial than it had been in previous decades. The younger generation did have different attitudes, shaped by education and exposure to outside ideas. But the marked men misjudged the pace and scope of change. They acted as if the transformation was complete when it was only beginning, as if the community had already accepted a new order when in fact the old order still held enough force to exact terrible consequences. This misjudgment is perhaps the central tragedy of the story, the sense that the outcome might have been different if the marked men had been more cautious, more willing to compromise, more attuned to the signals the community was sending. But tragedy is defined not by the possibility of a different outcome, but by the inevitability of the one that occurred, given the choices made and the context in which they were made. The marked men chose their path, and the community chose its response, and those choices locked together in a way that allowed for no other resolution. The aftermath of 1985 extended beyond the immediate participants. The families of the marked men, as mentioned, suffered lasting consequences. But so did the other families in the village, in more subtle ways. The use of such extreme measures, even when justified by the community's logic, carried a cost. It reinforced the power of collective judgment, but it also created a climate of fear, a sense that stepping out of line could result in outcomes that were swift and irreversible. This climate may have maintained order, but it also stifled certain kinds of change, certain kinds of questioning, certain kinds of individual expression that might have been valuable. The village became, in some respects, more rigid, more conservative, more closed in on itself. This was not necessarily intentional. It was a side effect of the response to the marked men, a natural consequence of choosing the harshest available mechanism to resolve a dispute. And it is a reminder that the maintenance of order, while necessary, is not without its own dangers, its own forms of harm. The documentation that exists about the events of 1985 is scattered and incomplete. There are references in Sigurimi files, brief mentions in reports that were filed and then archived, never to be followed up. There are testimonies collected years later by researchers interested in traditional law practices in Albania, interviews with elderly villagers who remembered the events and were willing to speak about them in carefully guarded language. There are fragments in the memories of those who left the village, who carried the story with them to other places, who told it to their children and grandchildren as a way of explaining where they came from and why they left. These fragments do not add up to a complete picture. They leave gaps, inconsistencies, areas where the truth is unclear or contested. but they provide enough to understand the basic contours of what happened, the dynamics that led to the marking of the 12 men, and the ways in which the community responded when its mechanisms of conflict resolution were rejected. The broader context of Albania in 1985 is also relevant to understanding the story. The country was approaching the end of Enver Hoxha's rule, though no one knew it at the time. Hoxha would die in April of that year, setting in motion a series of changes that would eventually lead to the collapse of the communist system and the opening of the country to the outside world. But in the months before his death, the system he had built was still firmly in place, and the highlands remained largely outside its direct control. Condemned traditional practices like blood feuds and clan-based justice, viewing them as backward, as obstacles to the construction of a modern socialist society. But the state lacked the capacity to fully suppress these practices, especially in remote areas where its presence was minimal and its legitimacy questioned. The result was a kind of dual system where official law and traditional code coexisted uneasily, with individuals and communities navigating between them depending on the situation. In the case of the marked men, the traditional code asserted itself decisively, and the state, when it became aware of the situation, chose not to intervene in any meaningful way. This choice reflected the pragmatic realities of governance in the highlands, the recognition that attempting to impose state authority in such cases could provoke resistance that the state was not equipped to handle. It also reflected a certain cynicism, a willingness to allow traditional mechanisms to operate, as long as they did not directly threaten the state's power, as long as they remained confined to internal village matters that could be ignored, without significant political cost. The marked men, in this sense, were victims not only of their own choices and the community's response, but also of a state system that was willing to abandon them when it proved convenient, that offered no protection because enforcing protection would have been too difficult, too costly, too politically complicated. The years since 1985 have seen significant changes in Albania, changes that have transformed the context in which such stories are understood. The country opened to the outside world in the early 1990s, and the subsequent decades brought modernization, economic development, integration with European institutions, and a gradual strengthening of the rule of law. The highlands are no longer as isolated as they were. The codes that governed life there have weakened further, though they have not disappeared entirely. Blood feuds still occur, though with less frequency and under different circumstances. The authority of elders has diminished, replaced in part by formal institutions, in part by the diffusion of authority that comes with increased mobility and exposure to alternative values. But the legacy of the old codes remains, embedded in memory, in family stories, in the ways that certain conflicts are still understood and discussed. The story of the 12 marked men is part of that legacy, a reminder of a time when the codes had real force, when violations carried consequences that were immediate and personal, when the community's judgment could determine life and death. For those who research or study traditional law practices in Albania, the events of 1985 represent a significant case, an example of how such systems operated in practice, how they intersected with state authority, and how they were experienced by those subject to them. The case has been referenced in academic papers, in human rights reports, in studies of conflict resolution in post-communist societies. It serves as evidence of the persistence of traditional practices even within a modern state framework, and as a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing such practices to operate outside the rule of law. But for those who lived through the events, or who have family connections to the village, the story is not primarily an academic case study. It is a part of their history, a piece of their identity, a source of both pride and shame, depending on which side of the conflict one's family was on. The question of how to judge what happened in 1985 remains open. Was the community's response justified given the context and constraints they faced? Were the marked men victims of a brutal system, or were they architects of their own fate? Is the story one of necessary justice or of extrajudicial violence? The answers depend in part on one's perspective, on the values and assumptions one brings to the evaluation. From a perspective that prioritizes individual rights and the rule of law, the marking and removal of the 12 men was a clear violation, an act of collective violence that should be condemned, and if possible, prosecuted. From a perspective that prioritizes community survival and the maintenance of social order in the absence of functional state authority, the response was a necessary if regrettable action, a last resort taken only after all other mechanisms had failed. Both perspectives capture something true about the situation, and both leave something out. The reality is messier, more ambiguous, more human than either narrative allows. The men who were marked made choices, and those choices had consequences. But they also lived within structures of power and tradition that limited their options and shaped their decision-making in ways they may not have fully understood. The community that marked them acted to preserve its own stability, but in doing so it also inflicted harm, created trauma, and reinforced patterns of violence that would echo forward in time. The story is not one of heroes and villains. It is a story of people caught in circumstances that were difficult and dangerous, making decisions with incomplete information and under immense pressure, living with the consequences of those decisions long after the immediate crisis had passed. It is, in the end, a very human story, and that humanity is perhaps the most important thing to remember when considering what happened in northern Albania in 1985. The village today is quieter than it was then. Many of the families have left, and those who remain are mostly elderly, tending small plots, living off pensions and remittances from children and grandchildren who have made lives elsewhere. The stone houses that once sheltered large multi-generational households now stand empty or have been repurposed as storage sheds. The pasture land that was the source of so much conflict is used only sporadically, and the careful boundaries that once mattered so much have blurred. The elders who made the judgment in 1985 are gone, and the generation that remembers the marked men firsthand is also fading. Soon the story will exist only in its retold forms, in the fragments preserved by researchers and family historians, in the simplified versions passed down as cautionary tales. And perhaps that is appropriate. Stories like this, one, are meant to be remembered, not for their specific details, but for what they reveal about the human capacity for both cooperation and violence, about the ways in which communities maintain order, and the costs of that maintenance, about the thin line between justice and revenge, between collective action and mob rule. The 12 marked men of 1985 are part of that longer story, a story that is still being written in the highlands and elsewhere, wherever people must navigate the tension between individual desire and collective need, between the rules they inherit and the rules they wish to create. Their story is not unique, but it is particular, rooted in a specific time and place, shaped by the geography and history and culture of Tendi, northern Albania. And in that particularity lies its value, its capacity to illuminate something larger about the human condition, about the choices we make when faced with conflict, about the consequences of those choices, and about the long shadow they cast over the lives of those who survive them.